The night Theodora Wynn saved a man's life, she was elbow-deep in a mop bucket and praying nobody would notice her. That was the thing about being the overnight cleaning staff at Hargrove Capital. Nobody ever did. She'd worked the building for 3 years. 31 floors of glass and marble and men in suits who looked straight through her like she was furniture. She clocked in at 9, clocked out at 5 in the morning, and in between she scrubbed their bathrooms and emptied their wastebaskets, and listened to the kind of conversations people have when they think no one is paying attention. She was good at being invisible. She'd had a lot of practice. Theodora was 28 years old, full-figured in the way that made people use words like sturdy or heavyset when they were trying to be polite, and considerably less kind when they weren't. She wore her dark hair pulled back. She wore sensible shoes. She wore the kind of expression that said, "I am here to clean your floors and nothing else." And she wore it so convincingly that people genuinely forgot she was there. That was, in almost every way, exactly how she wanted it. What nobody at Hargrove Capital knew, what nobody in her entire life had ever really understood, was that Theodora Wynn held degrees in international finance and applied linguistics from Georgetown University. She spoke 7 languages fluently: English, French, Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese. She'd spent 2 years after graduation working for a private intelligence consultancy in Geneva before something happened, something she didn't talk about, that sent her back to the States, broke and exhausted and unwilling to explain herself to anyone. She'd taken the cleaning job because it paid cash, required no references, and asked nothing of her brain. She had not expected the night of October 14th. It started the way most bad nights started at Hargrove Capital, with the elevator doors opening at an hour when they shouldn't, and too many men stepping out of them. Theodora was mopping the 31st floor corridor when she heard them. She recognized the sound, the specific cadence of men walking in formation, the way their footsteps didn't scatter, the way regular businessmen's did but landed together, synchronized, deliberate, mop. She'd heard that rhythm before. In Geneva, in places she tried not to think about. She pressed herself back into the alcove beside the supply closet. 6 men. Then 8. Then a figure at the back who walked differently from all of them. Slower, more deliberate, with the kind of absolute stillness in his upper body that came from years of training himself not to betray anything. Caspian Rowe. She knew him by reputation. Everyone in the financial world did, even the people who pretended they didn't. 36 years old. CEO of Rowe Consolidated, a holding company with legitimate interests in shipping, real estate and private equity, and other interests that were considerably less legitimate. His family had been running the Eastern Seaboard's most sophisticated financial crime operation for 2 generations. He was smart enough to have never been charged with anything. He was dangerous enough that prosecutors who'd come close had quietly moved on to other priorities. He was also, at this particular moment, using the 31st floor conference room at Hargrove Capital for what was very clearly not a scheduled business meeting. Theodora counted the men filing in. 2 were Rowe's, 4 she didn't recognize. Eastern European, she thought, from their build and their clothing and something about the way they held the room. And then, trailing behind with the nervous energy of someone who knew exactly how much danger they were in, came a man in a wrinkled suit, carrying a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. The door closed. Theodora stood in the alcove for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up her mop bucket and walked very calmly to the supply closet, which happened to share a ventilation panel with the conference room. She told herself she was just waiting for them to leave so she could finish the floor. She told herself that for about 45 seconds. Then she heard the first sentence in Russian, and everything changed. The man with the briefcase was named Hartwell. She pieced that together quickly. He was some kind of intermediary, a financial broker who moved money between parties who couldn't be seen moving money between themselves. He'd apparently been doing this work for Rowe for 2 years and had apparently recently made an error. The 4 men she didn't recognize were representatives of a consortium she'd heard whispered about in Geneva, Ostrov Group, specifically the Bucharest faction, which was the most aggressive and least forgiving of the 3 main branches. And they were not happy. The one doing the talking was a thick-shouldered man whose voice she'd later think of as belonging to someone who'd never once in his life been told no and processed it calmly. He spoke in a mix of Romanian and Russian, switching between them mid-sentence the way bilingual speakers did when they were agitated. His name, as far as she could tell, was something that sounded like Tiberiu. Tib, his subordinates called him, and he was currently explaining to Caspian Rowe, very patiently, that if the discrepancy in the Limassol accounts was not resolved in the next 72 hours, Rowe Consolidated would not be the only party absorbing the loss. His assistant was translating this badly. Theodora recognized the translator immediately for what he was. A kid, mid-20s, probably hired for his Russian, which was good, but whose Romanian was clearly functional at best. He was softening Tiberiu's language dramatically. The phrases that should have landed like a fist were arriving like a gentle tap. When Tiberiu said, in Romanian, leaning slightly toward Russian syntax, "We will take the infrastructure and leave nothing standing," the translator offered, "They want to renegotiate terms of the existing agreement." Caspian Rowe, to his credit, seemed like he knew something was being lost in translation. She could hear it in the pauses. The precise, careful pauses of a man who was very intelligent and very suspicious, and currently in possession of incomplete information. There was another exchange. Tiberiu again, faster now, more irritated. He said something that made his subordinate straighten slightly, the kind of micro-reaction that meant he'd just escalated. The translator paused for too long, started a sentence, stopped, started again. He says they are willing to extend a period of consideration if certain, stop. Caspian Rowe's voice was quiet and completely flat. What did he actually say? He said they're flexible about the timeline. That's not what he said. Another pause. Tiberiu watched this exchange with the expression of a man who had brought these interpreters specifically because he wanted the language gap and was now slightly annoyed that it was becoming obvious. Theodora did not make a decision so much as find herself outside the supply closet, mop handle still in hand, walking down the corridor toward the conference room door. She stopped outside it. Put her hand on the handle. "Don't," said every sensible part of her brain. She opened the door. The room went silent in a way that had texture to it. Every man in that conference room turned to look at her, and what they saw was a heavy-set woman in a grey cleaning uniform holding a mop, with a streak of cleaning solution on her right forearm and her hair escaping from its ponytail, standing in the doorway of a room where people with guns were conducting business they did not want witnessed. One of Rowe's men had a weapon drawn before she'd fully stepped inside. "Cleaning staff." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. "I heard the light on. I'm sorry. I didn't realize the room was occupied. I'll come back." She turned to leave. "Wait." It was Caspian Rowe's voice. She stopped. She heard him stand, heard his footsteps cross the room toward her, measured and unhurried. He stopped close enough that she could see without turning around. His reflection in the darkened window, tall, dark-haired, with a face that was striking in the way that said, "This is not a soft man. You've been standing outside this room." It wasn't a question. "I've been cleaning the corridor," she said. "For how long?" She turned around then, found his eyes. They were dark grey, extremely direct, and held them. "Long enough," she said, "to know that whoever you're using to translate Romanian is going to get you killed." The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. Tiberiu said something in Romanian, fast and sharp, 3 words. "He wants to know," she said, without looking away from Caspian Rowe, who the woman is and whether she should be removed. Another long silence. Caspian Rowe's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a very slight adjustment, like a dial turning a fraction of a degree. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. It was, objectively speaking, the most dangerous thing Theodora Wynn had ever done, and she had done some genuinely dangerous things. Tiberiu looked at her with the particular contempt reserved for people who showed up in places they clearly had no business being. He said something under his breath in Romanian. She understood every word of it, including the words she chose not to translate. "Tell him," Caspian Rowe said, "that I'd like to clarify the terms of the timeline we're discussing. Directly, please. No softening." She said, in Romanian, good Romanian, the Bucharest cadence she'd spent 8 months cultivating during a consultancy job that required it, that Mr. Rowe would like to revisit the terms of the Limassol account directly, and that he was aware the previous translation may not have conveyed the full terms of the original proposal. Tiberiu went very still. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, slowly, something that she'd translate afterward as, "Where did you find a cleaning woman who speaks Romanian?" She answered him in Romanian. "I found myself." There was a beat of silence. Then, almost involuntarily, Tiberiu let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, but close. It cracked the tension in the room just slightly, the way a hairline fracture runs across glass. He leaned back. He said something to the man on his right, fast, in the dialect she'd identified as specific to a neighborhood in Sector 2. She filed this away automatically. Old habit. Then he looked back at her and said, in very deliberate English, that he had clearly been holding in reserve, "Your interpreter is better than mine." "This is embarrassing," she said. "I'm just the cleaning staff." He said, "I don't think so." The next 4 hours were the most surreal of her life. She sat at that conference table and translated. Not just translated, mediated. Because what she could hear, under the language itself, was the architecture of what each party actually wanted, which was not at all what they were saying out loud. Tiberiu wanted assurance. He was aggressive because the Bucharest faction was under pressure from above, and aggression was the only currency he trusted in negotiations like this. He didn't actually want to tear down Rowe Consolidated's infrastructure. He wanted to know it wouldn't collapse under him. Caspian Rowe wanted the same thing. He wanted to know that the Ostrov Group would hold the line if the Limassol situation attracted scrutiny. He was cautious because he'd been in rooms like this before, and he knew that the most dangerous moment was never the obvious confrontation. It was the secondary conversation, the one happening in someone's head while they nodded and appeared to agree. She could hear both of those things clearly. She'd been trained to. What she did over 4 hours was translate the actual conversation instead of the spoken one. At one point, Tiberiu said something in Russian, dropping back into it deliberately, she thought, as a test to see if her Russian matched her Romanian. She answered him in Russian. Good Russian. Moscow inflected, slightly formal, the way she'd learned it from a professor at Georgetown who'd defected in 1987 and never stopped being furious about it. Tiberiu looked at her with something that was, for the first time, not contempt. At another point, one of his subordinates passed him a note, and he read it, and then said something in Romanian under his breath that she wasn't sure she was supposed to hear. It was about a parallel agreement, a side arrangement between one of Rowe's subsidiaries and a competing entity, something that, if true, would explain the Limassol discrepancy entirely. She relayed this to Caspian Rowe very carefully, watching his face. His face told her nothing, which meant it was true. He excused himself for 12 minutes. When he came back, the man with the briefcase, Hartwell, was no longer in the room and the energy had shifted. She didn't ask. Around 3 in the morning, Tiberiu accepted a glass of water, which in her experience meant a negotiation was moving from confrontation to resolution, and said in Romanian slowly, for the first time addressing her with something like directness, that the Limassol issue could be considered suspended pending a review of the terms she had outlined. She translated this. Caspian Rowe said, "Tell him I appreciate his patience." She translated this. Tiberiu said, "Tell Rowe I appreciated his interpreter." She said in Romanian, "I'm not his interpreter." He said, "Then what are you?" She thought about it. "Tonight? Whatever you needed me to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, which from Tiberiu she suspected was the equivalent of a standing ovation. They left at 3:47 in the morning. She sat at the conference table for a moment after they were gone, listening to the ventilation system and the distant sound of elevator doors closing, and tried to remember how her legs worked. Caspian Row did not leave. He stood at the window, the one facing the harbor, where the lights of the bridges made cold geometry in the darkness, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You knew what Marchetti was going to do before he moved." He meant one of Tiberiu's men, the one who'd reached for something under his jacket around the 2-hour mark, during a particularly sharp exchange. She'd redirected the conversation before it became a problem. She'd been aware she was doing it. She hadn't been aware he'd noticed. "He telegraphs," she said. "His right shoulder drops about 2 seconds before." "How do you know that?" It wasn't a question this time either. He had a habit of that, of removing the inflection from things that should have been questions, as if he already knew the answers and was just confirming them. "I've been in rooms like this before," she said. "Not as a cleaner?" "No," she agreed. "Not as a cleaner." He turned from the window. In the low light of the conference room, just the building's ambient glow from outside, he looked different than he had at the start of the night, still guarded, still completely unreadable in the ways that mattered. But something had shifted. The particular attention he was paying her had changed quality. "What happened in Geneva?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "You had me checked. I had everyone in the building checked when I booked the room. You came up as Theodora Wynn, cleaning staff, no prior employment history before 2022. He tilted his head slightly. "That's not a record. That's a gap." She almost smiled. "I made some choices," she said, "that I wasn't sure were the right ones at the time. Turned out they were, but they came with costs." "What kind of choices?" "The kind," she said, "that meant I couldn't go back to the work I was doing." He studied her. She let him. "You don't have to clean floors," he said. "I know that, so why?" "Because," she said, "no one asks you anything when you're cleaning floors." And for a while I needed that. He was quiet. Outside, a tugboat horn sounded from somewhere down on the harbor, low and distant. "What do you need now?" he asked. She thought about that. It was the most honest question anyone had asked her in 3 years. She said, "Fair," he said. He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, what you did tonight wasn't just translation. You read Tiberiu faster than my best risk analysts would have. His tells are obvious if you know what you're looking for. They weren't obvious to anyone else in this room." He said it simply, without embellishment. "You're extraordinary, Miss Wynn." She said nothing. "I'll have your safety assessed tonight. You shouldn't go home alone. Tiberiu is professional, but I don't know his subordinates' temperaments after a night like this." He said it practically, without drama. "My driver will take you wherever you need to go. That's not necessary." "It isn't optional," he said. Then, slightly quieter, "Please." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her cleaning uniform, and picked up the mop handle she'd been carrying for the last 4 hours, like a very undignified scepter. "All right," she said. The driver was waiting in the underground garage. She sat in the back of a black car that cost more than 6 months of her rent, and looked out the window at the empty pre-dawn streets, and tried to figure out what exactly had just happened to her life. Her phone rang at 4:15 a.m. "Unknown number," she answered. "This is Rowe." His voice was different on the phone, more clipped, less careful. "There's a situation with the Mita Limassol accounts that's going to require someone who can read Romanian financial documentation and produce analysis in English by Thursday morning. The firm I normally use for this is compromised. I need a new one." She watched a streetlight pass overhead. "I understand," she said. "I don't need you to understand. I need you to say yes or no." "I know what I watched you do for 4 hours," he said. "That's more than I know about most people I hire." A long pause. "I'll need to see the documents first," she said, obviously, "and I set my own terms, expected, and—" She thought about this. "I'm not an employee. I'm a contractor. I work on my terms, my timeline, and I don't attend meetings unless I choose to." Agreed. She looked out the window at the city coming up slowly around her. the first grey edges of morning beginning to separate the skyline from the sky. "All right," she said, for the second time that night. There was a brief pause. She thought she heard, very faintly, something that might have been the beginning of a word he decided not to say. Then, "I'll send the documents in the morning." He ended the call. She sat for another moment watching the city. The driver turned onto the bridge, and below her the harbour was still dark, the lights along the opposite shore throwing their reflections in long, pale lines across the water. Theodora Wynn had spent 3 years making herself invisible, and had been spectacularly bad at it when it actually mattered. She found, somewhere in the space between exhaustion and something that wasn't quite the opposite of fear, that she didn't entirely mind. The Limassol documents arrived at 7 a.m. A courier, a sealed envelope, a separate encrypted drive. She opened the drive on a laptop she kept for exactly this kind of thing, air-gapped, old, purchased for cash, and began to read. By noon, she'd found 3 irregularities that shouldn't have been there. By 2 in the afternoon, she'd found the 4th one, which was the one that explained the other 3, and she sat back in her kitchen chair and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The discrepancy wasn't an error. It had been constructed, carefully, deliberately, over 18 months, by someone inside Roe Consolidated who understood Romanian banking law well enough to hide something in plain sight, in a language they'd assumed nobody on Roe's team would read closely enough to catch. She thought about that for a while, then she picked up her phone. "I found it," she said, when he answered. A pause. Thursday was the deadline. It's Tuesday afternoon. A longer pause. "Where?" he asked. "In the secondary filings. Layer 3. Someone inside your organization has been moving approximately 4% of the Limassol funds through a shell structure in Cyprus. The documentation is in Romanian, because whoever built this assumed you'd have it translated by someone who wasn't paying close enough attention to the verb conjugations in the ownership clauses." Silence. "Verb conjugations," he said. "In Romanian," she said, "the way you conjugate the verbs in a legal ownership clause tells you whether the subject is the primary holder or a secondary beneficiary. Someone conjugated these as primary holder. They should be secondary. It's a small difference. It's also the difference between legitimate fund management and theft." A very long silence. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. She heard him exhale, controlled, deliberate, but there. "Send me what you have, already done." Another pause. "Where are you? Home. I mean, are you safe?" She looked around her apartment, the stacked books, the cold cup of coffee, the laptop glowing on the kitchen table, the very ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Yes," she said, "I'm fine." "Good." He said it with a certainty that felt, strangely, less like professional obligation and more like something else. "I'll need to move on this quickly. There's going to be fallout. I know. Some of it might come in your direction. I've handled fallout before. Not from inside Roe Consolidated. Are you warning me?" A pause. "I'm asking," he said, "whether you want to be somewhere with better security while this resolves itself." She understood what he was and wasn't saying. She looked at her window, her ordinary street, her ordinary city. "Send me the address," she said. "Already done." She almost laughed. She moved into the Roe Consolidated safe house that evening, a brownstone in a part of the city where the buildings were old and the security was not visible but absolutely present. She was given a room on the 2nd floor and a workstation, and told that the house had 12 rooms, and she was free to use the library. She used the library immediately. It was, genuinely, an extraordinary library. She was in it at midnight when she heard footsteps on the stairs that she'd already learned were his, that same unhurried, deliberate wait, and looked up to find Caspian Roe standing in the doorway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and what she was almost certain was the first unguarded expression she'd seen on his face. "You found the library," he said. "I found the library," she confirmed. He crossed the room, not toward her but toward the far bookshelf, and pulled a volume from it with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where it was. He looked at the spine for a moment, then put it back. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about needing to be invisible for a while." She waited. "I spent 6 years," he said, making sure everyone saw exactly what I wanted them to see. Not invisible. The opposite. He looked at the books, not at her. It requires a similar kind of attention, the performance of it. Yes, she said, it does. I'm not particularly good at this, he said. Good at what? There was something very direct in it. Not the calculation she'd seen in the conference room, but something without the professional coating. Raw, in the way that people who spent years controlling everything occasionally allowed one uncontrolled moment. Talking to someone I actually want to talk to, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. You're doing all right, she said. A pause. Then, very slightly, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that happened slowly and didn't quite reach completion, as if it was still deciding whether it was safe to be there. She thought it was probably the first genuinely involuntary thing she'd seen him do. Get some sleep, he said. We have a meeting at 8. With who? The person who built the Cypress structure. His voice was quiet again. I'd like you there. To translate. To listen, he said. The way you listen. She nodded. He moved to leave. Then stopped with his hand on the doorframe. Theodora, she looked up. I don't think you were ever really invisible, he said. I think people just weren't paying attention. He left. She sat in the library for a while longer, surrounded by books in several languages and the quiet of the old house, and thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who was, himself, very practiced at not being seen. Outside, the city kept its own council, as cities do. The bridges were lit, the harbor was dark, and somewhere in a building across town, in a set of Romanian financial documents that she had read more carefully than anyone had expected, the truth was sitting right where it had always been, waiting for someone fluent enough to find it. She picked up her book. She was already looking forward to 8 o'clock.